Hello, everyone. I'm Soumya Sven. I'm an assistant archivist at the Archives at NCBS, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all to the 52nd edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. As some of you who've attended these talks before, and some of you who might be familiar with the space, might know, the Archives at NCBS is a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. We house over 100,000 processed papers, photographs, equipment, recordings, and more. If you have some time today, please do drop by our space. We're downstairs at the ELC basement, so right around the corner from here. If you find one of us from the team, we'll be very happy to give you a tour. And you can also find us online at archives.ncbs.res.in. As a part of our programming, we organize this lecture series with talks by individuals based on their vast body of work and of service. These talks are framed around explorations in and around the archives and more broadly around the history of ideas. The series has included discussions by artists, archivists, academics, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and more. For today's lecture, which is the 52nd of the series, we are honored to welcome Sevanti Ninan to our campus. Sevanti has been a reporter at the Hindustan Times and the Indian Express, and a media commentator for the Indian Express, the Hindu, and Mint. She now writes for Telegraph India. She was the founder editor of The Hood, which is a media watchdog platform, and later also created the Hood Archives, which is hosted at the Ashoka University. She is the author of Through the Magic Window, which is on television and change in India, and Headlines from the Heartland, Reinventing the Hindi Public Sphere. She has also edited The Hood Reader with Subarna Chatterjee. Her talk today is titled Paradox of the Media, Plentiful yet Unviable, Plentiful yet Unfree. We will have some time for a Q&A after the talk is over. And of course, the discussion can continue over refreshments outside once we're done. Thank you so much for your time and effort, Sevanti, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. The topic of my talk. Basically, all kinds of things have been happening for the media, in the media for some time now. So it's an interesting thing to look at. So I'm going to talk about the paradox of the media because there's plenty of it, and yet it's both unviable. Viability is a very important thing because you can stay free if you're viable, and it's unfree as well, increasingly. India is media rich. Currently, it has more privately owned media than most countries in the world. The 400 plus news channels and 1.8 lakh plus publications are a consequence of several things: rising literacy, markets that exist in multiple languages, opportunities created by technology, budding entrepreneurship at many levels, and above all, by commerce seeking consumers. We are on track to become the world's 5th biggest newspaper market in terms of revenue by 2026. And we have the largest, and will have the largest newspaper readership, overtaking China by 2025. The size of our population, low internet penetration compared to other newspaper markets, growing literacy, low pricing, all these factors will ensure this. It will not be either our journalism or our reporting that takes us to any international heights. The New York Times, for instance, currently has some 1,700 journalists reporting from 160 countries. But in the past 2 decades, have seen India's television news channels withdrawing feet on the ground and replacing news with debates. There's less and less news gathering. Our biggest newspapers have shrunk their foreign correspondent deployment to 3 or 4 major countries at best. And for most newspapers, state bureaus within India have shrunk to a single correspondent or 2 or 3 at best. The 8 states in the Northeast are likely to be covered by 1 or 2 people at most for most national newspapers. Media expanded in India because the growth of literacy presented a market. Between 1951 and 1991, there was a 7-fold increase in the number of literates in India. By the time the onset of liberalization came, it meant advertising became available. And that was also around after 1991. So by the time, with the onset of liberalization, readers also became available when advertising. When literacy expanded, for instance, in India's Hindi heartland, newspapers followed, picking up readers in places where they had been none. Rising farm incomes and a growing service sector led to the emergence of a rural middle class, which made newspapers affordable. The other set of players in developing regional media markets, particularly those for the language press, which reached villages, were the multinationals who came in post-liberalization and began to conduct readership surveys to understand the distribution and purchasing power of the emerging middle class in the 1990s. Robin Jeffrey, who's looked at the newspaper revolution in India, spelled out the relationship between print and capitalism. Burgeoning newspapers were capitalist enterprises. You needed capital for the investment in news gathering. You needed printing technology and distribution. Capitalism in the later 20th century liked large markets, he said. So newspapers took to localizing because if you're going into regions which have not been covered, if you're going into the rural areas, villages, districts, advertisers see a commodity that is worth buying, which is rural and small town spending power. You need the new printing technology that makes local printing possible, and you need to give people news about themselves. Proliferation of the media took off because of these factors, but also because a new generation in the media owning families began running these publications and strategized to capitalize on this convergence of factors. One of them said, when you launch a newspaper, you have to purchase the readership. So the more colorful examples is the fact that the Dainik Bhaskar, for instance, spent 10 million rupees distributing classic chairs with new subscriptions, which garnered for it a 30% increase in circulation. There were also gift schemes, there were price wars, and the young families, kids who became managers also realized that what would sell in villages was local news. And that for that, you don't need journalists, they said. So they employed stringers who would be shopkeepers or local journalists or local gentry, and that became the norm. Minal Pandey, who edited the Hindi Hindustan for several years, describes in her recent book how expenditure on advertising in the Hindi press grew, leading to expansion of regional language media, a segment which today has the highest circulated newspapers in the country. In fact, localization came to the south earlier with the Malayalam Manorama and Inadu, and to other parts of the country. In Anandabazar Patrika, you distribute the main paper you insert a district insert. So the same paper goes everywhere, but with that district insert, it can give news to the completely local village, even village readership. When newspapers began invading each other's territories, a single district could end up having 3 local editions. And not only advertising was difficult to come by, became more difficult to come by, but I imagine news also would become difficult to come by if you were doing so much reporting out of there. Newspaper proliferation happened at the same time as the satellite TV revolution. More media outlets chasing the same advertising. And in the English press, particularly the Times Group, which is always a trendsetter for management things, issues, the new generation had taken charge, and they followed an aggressive marketing strategy by dropping the cover price. The first consequence of so much media or too much media is an unviable industry. If you drop your cover price to increase circulation, you lose subscription revenue. If you do a Faustian bargain with Google or Meta to find readers and viewers, then they take much of your advertising. If you have too much non-serious competition, because cable operators, politicians, and sundry others have got into the game, then you don't get advertising. Being unviable and unfree comes from expansion and politicization. It also comes from rapid developments in technology, which engender new forms of media, new sources of media revenue, new possibilities for multiplying advertising, and thereby new publications, TV channels, and online media ventures. So the latter 3 things add up to a single outcome, which is too much media. The subscription price, which dropped to rock bottom, also has to support the cost of ground distribution for newspapers. A newspaper like the Sahara, which was started by a chit fund owner, introduced incentives for hawkers as well, bicycle for selling 20 copies, motorbike for bringing in 200 subscribers, and more enterprising hawkers then grew into circulation agents. Cover price dropping was followed by other innovations to boost revenue. Paid news supplements, which carried interviews and features for a price. Then a scheme called private treaties, which again the Times brothers thought up, which offered equity for advertising. All of this impacted journalism, because if you had a private treaty with a company, what it meant in practice that the paper could go soft on that company if it became involved in a controversy. Paid news was essentially PR masquerading as journalism. Paid news during elections was particularly controversial. Articles formatted as news stories were carried about candidates, which would say at the bottom, right at the bottom, in tiny letters, something to the effect of advertising or whatever. ADVT. Managers hired by media firms now began to be people who'd worked in consumer goods companies like fizzy drinks and soap manufacturing. Thank you so much. Sweet. Thank you. And soap manufacturing companies. If being unviable comes from having too much media, then being unfree is partly a consequence of the same lack of viability. To understand why it seems like the news media in India today is under siege, you have to take a long view, not just going back to the early 1990s when liberalization triggered major changes, but also to the early 1950s. Our expectations of the role that media must play derived from the important concept of an fourth estate, which we keep using that term, which goes back to 18th, 19th century England. Both Macaulay and Burke referred to the fourth estate of the realm. The notion of a fourth estate in the Indian context has been unpacked by the academic Vibod Parthasarathy. He says two ideas at the core of the liberal models of the press that have become globalized are that of being a watchdog, alluding to its role that you're supposed to watch the government of the day, and of the fourth estate, referring to its institutional side. The idea of the fourth estate is premised around a watchdog press discovering the abuse of power by the other three estates. The media plays a watchdog role to make governments accountable to citizens. But then he goes on to argue that the fourth estate, out of which the press emerges, is usually something embedded in society. You have to locate the abstraction called the fourth estate in Indian society and polity. It emerged under the evolving colonial political economy of 19th century India and the expansion of newspapers during the early 20th century in some cases, even in the mid-19th century, saw news outlets that were directly owned or controlled by politicians and businessmen. He documents how the last quarter of the 19th century, newspapers in English and in Indian languages were owned by regional politicians of various importance, social reformers of different hues, and sundry regional religious denominations. Subsequently, there has grown to be widespread ownership of news outlets by formal political interests, legislators and their immediate families, and by diversified business interests, industrialists, traders, sundry financiers. The media actors who are expected to conform to ideas of journalism imported from other societies are embedded in this society with, which has been described. At which point then does a commercial or political construct or become a watchdog, a guarantor of democracy, an estate holding the state in polity to account. The concerns of a media ownership in India manifested themselves shortly after independence, with the Press Commission being appointed, and then the Press Commission report in 1954 gives examples of owners influencing reportage and editorials. Already, I mean, this is early in our journey as an independent country. Chapter 15 of the report has these fascinating subheads: forms of ownership, boosting of the proprietor, writing up business activities, meaning of the proprietor or whoever of the company that owns it, biased reporting and editing of news, interests of the owner, sensationalism to raise circulation, and so on. So if we think that sensationalism in news is a concern only in satellite TV post 1991, it actually dates back very much earlier. And it came from print. Other chapters in that 1954 report also look at bias and external pressure and competition and monopolies. Ownership regulation is something that never came to India, never actually happened in India, though the first attempt to legislate on ownership of media was made in 1971. And we're still trying. As recently as, last week, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India was again holding an open house discussion on the consultation paper on media ownership in India. The government is still looking at concentration of ownership and cross-media ownership, among other issues. The fact that ownership is still not regulated in broadcasting means that the entry of players who will distort the news market is permitted. You don't say who can own the media, and you don't lay down what they're supposed to do and not do. There was self-regulation that, and actually this is always a tussle. The media fights back a lot whenever there's a firm law being proposed. So I'm sorry, I don't remember the date, but somewhere in the last decade or two, there has been self-regulation, which doesn't amount to very much. Meaning, you set up your own broadcasting organization, not just organization, industry sets up its own panel and they regulate. When there are too many players, some of whom are not there to do news, but to buy influence or protect their businesses, then it affects the viability of the industry at large. There simply isn't enough advertising to sustain hundreds of channels. Then you get a viewership ratings industry, which helps advertisers know who has better viewership. Ratings can also be bought. In 2021, there was a criminal case registered with the channel head accused of bribing the head of the ratings agency to give his channel the highest ratings. When there is no regulation, many agendas are served in the guise of news broadcasting on television or in print. Why does a trucking company own media in Assam? Or why does he want to own a newspaper? Because he thinks it will protect him from insurgency outfits in the states, as the editor of one such newspaper in Guwahati explained. Why does a politician want to own media? Because it gives him both a platform and a tool. But media viability goes for a 6 when a cash-rich political family invests in the industry. In 2008, when there was a media recession on, and when it was settling in everywhere in the world, in Andhra Pradesh, Chief Minister Rajshekar Reddy's son began a 23-edition Telugu daily called Sakshi from Hyderabad and other cities. Since then, of course, this particular state has many political families, including that of the current Chief Minister, all launch media projects. By the year 2013, the media business writer Vanita Kohli Khandekar was estimating that more than a third of the news channels in the country were now owned by politicians or by politically affiliated builders. Many were just political vehicles, others peddle influence for builders. The result was that companies that wanted to make money by running a good old-fashioned news outfit end up competing with ones that have no shareholders or investors to answer to. Similarly, an estimated 60% of cable distribution systems were owned by local politicians who had influenced and funded several local elections. There are dozens of small and big newspapers owned by politicians or their family members, which influence the course of several local elections. Many newspaper chains with political affiliations also own broadcast networks and internet portals. And yet there's another paradox. The media industry as a whole is thriving in India. The latest estimate is that it's worth some 161,000 crores. Of this, 16%, roughly, is the size of the news industry, which combines TV and print. And of that, a mere 3,000 crore was the revenue earned by News TV. All these channels that you see that do all kinds of sensational things to get a viewership and advertising. Entertainment TV, however, she says, has had a revenue of 72,000 crore. Vanita Khandekar looked at the changing picture of the top 10 list of media companies over 10 years. In 2012, the Times Group headed the list with 5,500 crore. In 2022, Google headed the list with 25,000 crore, followed by Meta and Sony Z. The Times Group had slipped to 5th place. There are only 2 publishers in the top 10 now, Times and DB Corp, which is the publishers of Dainik Bhaskar, which is number 10 in the list. Social media clearly is worth more in many ways than the conventional media now. Meanwhile, the Modi government has chosen to delegitimize mainstream media in the first term of the BJP government. Co-option and self-censorship by this media have followed. Alongside, the use of social media has grown hugely, making the likes of WhatsApp powerful weapons in elections. Powerful weapon. The 5-year period of 2014 to 2019 has seen an explosion of internet connectivity, an explosion of cheap smartphones in small towns in rural India, leading to growing numbers online and on social media. The launch of Reliance Jio in September 2016, the 4G telecom service of Reliance Industries, did a lot to enable this. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India allowed Jio to offer its service free for 6 months. This racked up 100 million subscribers in 170 days. Subsequently, other telecom operators had to drop tariffs in order to compete, helping to deepen internet penetration, but also making it difficult for them to be financially secure. With 500 million Indians on the internet by the end of 2018, today the figure is like 700 million, a growth of 65% over 2016. The acquisition of WhatsApp by Facebook happened also in 2014, and its accelerated growth in India followed. With these 2 things, the mobile phone was shaping up as the BJP's most important weapon for the 2019 election. The widespread emergence of multiple media platforms, including social media, is redefining the role of media in politics and government and the relationship between the 2. Given Narendra Modi's earlier history with the news media as chief minister, particularly with some elements of the English media following the 2002 riots, his prime ministership has created a new template for media-government relations. In the 5 years of the first term of this government, party and government operated on a simple formula: delegitimize existing media, create your own channels of communication with the voter and citizen. Mr. Modi was elected in May 2014. In June, it was reported that the Prime Minister had asked both senior bureaucrats and cabinet colleagues to refrain from speaking with journalists. When surveyed on whether the government had really clammed up, Journalists covering government said cabinet notes and cabinet meeting agendas were no longer given, nor were interministerial exchanges coming out. The decision to shut down the Planning Commission and replace it with the Niti Aayog became known only when the Prime Minister announced it on Independence Day. It had been cleared by the cabinet earlier, but there was neither a briefing nor a leak. By 2014, it became clear that only official media would accompany the Prime Minister on his trips abroad, breaking from past practice. The Indian Prime Minister actually became the forerunner of a US president who demonstrated the same preference in communication, Twitter over press interactions. Though Mr. Modi has never met the press, and Trump actually, even when he was fighting with them, would keep meeting them. Long before Donald Trump came along, Narendra Modi took to using his Twitter handle with more than 11 million followers, then to convey day-to-day developments. And his tweets, therefore, became a source of news for the daily press. When ministers want to communicate, they too tweeted. Some tweeted every day. Then he started a monthly radio program, Man Ki Baat on All India Radio, and the program quickly began to drive stories in the press and on television. The notion that the government needs mainstream media was made to stand on its head, aided by a strong leader who quite simply just changed the rules of media engagement. No press conferences, no interviews except to handpick journalists, and those usually pre-screened questions, and often only written answers. He sidestepped critics and his government co-opted entire media houses. The fallout has been increasing self-censorship on one hand, because you don't want to offend the government, and proactive defense of the government on the other. With major media houses given to holding sponsored events every year as a source of revenue, because they're very hard up for sources of revenue, as I've said. They need the Prime Minister and his ministers to speak at their events. The Times Group learned that the hard way in March 2017. So the Prime Minister and his ministers and bureaucrats and Chandrababu Naidu, whose state was an official partner of the summit, all pulled out of the 18 Global Summit at the last minute. There was much speculation as to the reasons, including government displeasure with the Economic Times coverage of the Samajwadi Party leadership in the run-up to the UP elections. A few months later that year, the Times Group played ball when the BJP president filed his papers for the Rajya Sabha nomination. Stories in the Ahmedabad edition of the paper on his assets, as well as on Amit Shah's assets, as well as on Smriti Irani's educational qualifications, were taken down from the website hours after publication. The DNA newspaper, which belongs to Z Media, also took down their story. A more dramatic instance of the government leaning on a major newspaper came when the editor of the Hindustan Times resigned in September 2017, just 14 months after joining the paper. The paper had been running a hate tracker since July, which it described as a national database on crimes in the name of religion, caste, and race. After the editor's exit, the hate tracker was taken down. Here too, there was an annual event at stake, Speaking at the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit in November that year, the Prime Minister spoke about the many changes his government was bringing in the lives of ordinary people. And he wanted to know why the media was so negative. The postscript to this whole episode came in May 2019, when the former editor in question, Bobby Ghosh, suggested in a tweet that his resignation had not been so voluntary after all, and that government pressure was in. In the tenure of this government, media houses in India, TV, print, online, have all discovered the virtues of self-censorship. Published news items suddenly disappear from websites after being published. TV channels drop interviews or stories done by their correspondents. NDTV was exposed as a channel that had practiced internal censorship during the UPA regime as well. Sorry, it's blocking me. The entertainment channel Star Plus decided not to air a comedy act that mimicked Prime Minister Modi, and so on. Giving a new spin to self-censorship, several prominent news outlets took down their published articles on the post-demonetization bank deposits in an Ahmedabad-based bank, in which BJP President Amit Shah was a director. The INS news agency, which broke the story, however, said that it was based on information obtained through the RTI Act, and they would not be retracting the story. Denial of advertising is being used to bring the press to heel. The Union government is the country's largest advertiser. When COVID hit newspaper circulation, it only increased the print media's dependence on government advertising. The Indian Newspaper Society wrote to the Prime Minister asking for a stimulus package, no less. In return, you would naturally be expected to play ball. Today, media activism means fighting the government's battle for it. I just watched Times Now's coverage yesterday of the BBC documentary that has riled the government. And the current dispensation also distributes talking points to the media when major controversies erupt. When the Chinese intrusion took place, the Prime Minister's office distributed talking points to journalists, whose text one of them tweeted. It included such points as India stands solidly behind the Prime Minister. The Congress's efforts have been pushed back by a united nation led by a leader who leads from the front and so on. Akash Patel, in his book Price of the Modi Years, documents some of these talking points and then lists the television debates that followed such helpful hints. Revisiting what began in 2018 also helps one understand how governments work when they set out to change the rules of the game. Smriti Irani, as Minister for Information and Broadcasting, floated the idea of regulation for online media in the first quarter of that year. Until then, there had been no rules or codes of conduct that governed media on the internet. By early 2021, the government came up with IT rules, which were then challenged in court by several news organizations. Then nothing happened for a while, but just, I think last week or week before last, they've come up with a fresh draft of IT rules. You can be one of the biggest media markets in the world, and you can still have a pretty dismal free press ranking. Today, you have penalties for news reports, which are critical of government performance. but not for news shows which allow hate speech to be spewed. Not only is the media not the political influence it used to be at some periods of our history, but it is also a frequent victim. Last year, there were attacks almost every week in some part of this country. Journalists who had an assignment to cover the Hindu Mahapanchayat in New Delhi were assaulted by Hindutva groups. 3 were arrested in UP for reporting a leak of a class 12 English paper. A reporter was allegedly tortured in custody in Agra, and a local journalist was among those stripped and humiliated in Madhya Pradesh for their reporting on a BJP MP in the south. When alleged offenders are booked in Uttar Pradesh or Kashmir or Tripura, these incidents are marked by common features: registration of FIRs under non-bailable laws such as sedition and sections of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the propensity of the police to convert investigators such as reporters into offenders, and considerable inventiveness in creating a backstory in the charge sheet to back up the original charge. In October, Venkat, yeah, so have I exceeded my time? I don't know what time we started. We started at 5. Yeah, so I should be winding up. Another notice under UAPA was served to yet another journalist for tweeting that Tripura was burning. An anti-terrorism deterrent, no less, for journalistic hyperbole. The over-enthusiastic use of this law was underscored by the statistics that the government gave in the Rajya Sabha in December 2021. 4,690 people arrested in different parts of the country under UAPA in 3 years, 149 convicted. The state which reported the most arrests was UP, followed by Jammu and Kashmir and Manipur. So just briefly, during COVID-19, then other laws came into play, such as the Disaster Management Act and the Epidemic Diseases Act, and they were used in tandem with other sections of the IPC to criminalize reporting of the government's response to the pandemic, as well as its outcome of its handling, such as the migrant exodus. You can't criticize all that. Panicky administrations across the country used no less than 14 sections of the IPC, sections of the IT Act, the DMA, the UAPA, the Motor Vehicles Act, and provisions of the Scheduled Caste, Tribes and Prevention of Atrocities Act to issue show cause notices, lodge first information reports against reporters, and then arrest, confine, and torture. Just keep all this. So we also see crowdsourced censorship because there are so many offense takers who go to the police with complaints against something a journalist might have done. Intolerance of the digital media, which has not been co-opted by the government, has increased apace. September 2021 saw income tax surveys on the digital websites NewsClick and Newslaundry, both of whom were not given to practicing self-censorship. September 2022 saw an income tax survey on a Bangalore-based foundation which funds media. So citizens have, come together in the past few years to push back on the Citizenship Amendment Act. Farmers came together to fight the Farm Bill, but journalists don't come together enough to push back on regressive legislation. And certainly their proprietors don't say or do anything. Nor do citizens come together in a big way. In 1988, the Rajiv Gandhi government saw enough protesting journalists on the street to drop the defamation bill that it was trying to pass. Today, the pressure is more diffused. The controlling legislation is focused on online media. Journalists are a lot more divided for ideological and pragmatic reasons. So there's no pushback. Individual media proprietors do not unite to push back effectively. They make their quiet compromises to stay in business. And Ramoji Rao's Inadu TV empire, which had its origins in the Pick and Barron's newspaper back in 1984, is now part of Reliance Media. Raghav Bell's TV18 was taken over by Mukesh Ambani when he bought substantial shares in it. When he had bought substantial shares in it, then a moment comes when you decide that you're going to convert your shares into equity. Okay, and in this case, it was related to Network 18's TV 18's coverage of ARC during the Delhi elections. In both the latter cases, the entry point for outside control came because of equity sold in situations of financial vulnerability. Mukesh Ambani bought the equity in both cases. Last year, he sold the company which owned the NDTV shares to Gautam Adani. We can only speculate about the circumstances in which the sale took place. Some 12 years after they were bought to bail out NDTV when it was in financial straits. While other democracies bat for mainstream media, which is losing its viability on account of Google and Facebook, using media content without paying media companies, the Bharatiya Janata Party government in India is not about to shed any tears for the viability of mainstream media. Like Donald Trump, our leaders have little use for this category of media, but plenty of use for social media, which can be bent to their purpose. So at the beginning of the new year, the Indian news media and journalists in particular find themselves at an inflection point in their profession. The Editors Guild said as much at a day-long online introspection towards the end of last year. The problems are easily summed up. The government of the day has little use for independent journalism. It uses social media to communicate with voters. The Prime Minister uses All India Radio, Doordarshan, etc., etc. And with media entities changing hands at this point, it is an oligarch moment for media ownership. Media financing is an issue, viability is an issue. Big tech is eating into the online advertising that could have helped sustain online news reaches. Journalists have lost jobs after COVID affected newspaper distribution, advertising shrunk. The new labor codes, which have subsumed multiple existing laws, have also done away with the Working Journalists Act. So what support structures can be put in place? The country has a press council, a human rights commission, numerous courts, but it needs a growing network of human rights defenders, a galvanizing force created by an alliance of journalist organizations, concerned lawyers, civil society stalwarts to map a strategy for this canvas. India has had press freedom issues now for at least 2 decades, apart from the one-offs such as the emergency. But the annual consolidated monitoring data we get from Reporters Sans Frontier, we've had this problem for at least 2 decades. But the data we use even today to see what is happening in press freedom in the country, it's from Reporters Sans Frontier and the Committee to Protect Journalists, not from any organization here. Digital publishers have set up a legal defense mechanism for themselves, But for the many stringers, reporters, journalists in the districts, there is no legal defense at hand. When the government slaps cases on them. And the Editors Guild has only just begun to discuss this issue. So, but the more the government attacks, the more the government's attacks on digital news media widen and deepen, the more it sometimes stirs up public-spirited responses. So these are seen as David's ranged against the Bharatiya Janata Party's Goliath. So the Newslaundry co-founder tweeted after the IT visit to Newslaundry, since the IT survey in 2 days, we have got over ₹15 lakh in subscriber contribution. No sarkari ads, no groveling to large corporations, and they wonder how we get funded. That's how. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sevanti, for your insight. If you have questions or comments, please raise your hands and we'll get a mic over to you.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really interesting talk. So you spoke about all the issues with the Indian media industry, ownership, press freedom, etc. Could you talk about models that have actually worked in other countries? Like what kind of media ownership patterns? What works? I mean, we know what's gone wrong here, but what are some of the models?
See, in other countries, I mean, okay, so then you're saying there's no point talking about, but when you have big newspapers there, or big anything, I mean, it's not a given that the government can dictate to them or that they're going to shut up their reporters or any of that. And the solution, and what their model is actually, sorry, I didn't even talk about it, but the only solution is if readers, viewers, etc., pay, pay for media. If you pay enough for media, then it doesn't need to do all this. It can feel a little independent. So they have, I'm sorry, I don't know the figures, but between Washington Post and New York Times and so on, they have Guardian, they have built up solid subscription basis, and that's how they function.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Isn't this a recent phenomenon of seeking funds from readers? Like that wasn't always the case, right?
But they started long before than we did. We just never did it. You drop your price, you do all of this. They never did those things. They just decided when you needed to not be able to, and when you weren't able to manage with just advertising or there wasn't enough advertising, then they started, they built up their subscription networks much earlier. Yeah.
And compared to like the nations we were talking about, India was much more poor, and the people can't actually buy the subscription. What she was talking about, that like they have built a subscription base because they were able to buy that news subscription.
But where the poor are concerned, prices of both what you pay for your cable TV and what you pay for newspapers, the cover price is very low. And the whole point is that even the rural middle class can afford it. Actually, I want to say something, sorry, didn't quite fit into this. But for instance, the Hindi newspapers, they cannot command the kind of advertising rates that the big English press can. So they always kept their cover prices higher. And they did not become totally something dependent on. So I was just looking at the financials of one Hindi paper, Dainik Bhaskar, over the last 5 years. and it has been not hugely profitable. It has stayed in the black all 5 years. I was looking at the Hindustan Times, and it's 3 years out of 5, it ran into losses. The last quarter in September, it had a very sharp drop in its revenues compared to the September 21 quarter. So, ultimately, if you can manage some kind of, people will buy, you manage some kind of price. And the rest of us can afford it. It's just that Indians don't, they think media should go.
The quality of news is also dependent on the price. If you pay a certain price, you get a better coverage, or let's say premium news, or like newspapers which cost lower will have less coverage and more. Like,
you talk about the subscription online?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, so say that. Yes, then the minute you want, they give you, one is the kind of newspaper. I think the bigger ones have all, you see, earlier you could still read it. It's only very recent that the Indian Express has started doing this, and the Hindu started long. The Hindu is a model, because the Hindu is hyped and hyped and hyped. Not in Chennai, I don't think they hyped their prices. But in Delhi, it's the most expensive paper. It's for 15 rupees a day or something. And that was unheard of earlier. But it's done it. And it also charges for its online subscription.
But why Indians don't want to pay for this? Like, why they don't feel like, why they feel like their news should come free?
It's been made a habit for them. It never was. I mean, people always kept the price of the paper low, and they paid, and they ran the paper on advertising, paid news, all these kind of things that are there.
Maybe the whole industry has spoiled the people. Like the Geo case, first they gave free SIM and internet, and then they are charging. They have a subscription to the class now. People are buying it because they are.
Yes. So the Geo is a very clever thing, which the government did. I mean, the regulator is not supposed to go allowing any free. But your election is 1 year away or 2 years away or whatever, 2016. And so they do it. So it's actually most of the readership can afford, but we just don't want. And also the problem is that if you buy a newspaper, then you don't want to pay for the same thing online as well. But yeah, so I don't know. Actually, I should know, but I don't know what the subscriptions cost for some of these papers that we read.
It is around 1,500. Hindu was
1,500, and Express and all that.
Thank you for the talk. I'm here.
Which side? Stick up a hand or something. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the talk, Sevanti. I had one question and a couple of clarifications that I wanted to know. If we look at the history of news media, it's grown as capitalism has grown, and we can't separate news media's growth without looking at capitalism. So when we look at when we look at the way in which we're promoting, or a lot of independent media is seeking subscription, and many of us are also wanting to support independent media, etc. Are we actually asking for news media to operate outside of capitalism? Right? Like, because if you look at the logic of capitalism, it is to keep growing bigger and bigger, and that's how news media has also progressed, right? So we have news media corporations and
Yeah.
all that. So if that is the case, are we actually looking for a news media that operates outside the logics of capitalism? So that's my question. I have two clarifications I wanted from you. When you say media is plentiful, I understand that completely. But when you say that media is plentiful because we have all of these politicians, businessmen, etc., seeking reach and influences and investing in it. So there's a point in which you made, which said that when a rich family with a cash cow invests in media, it becomes unviable. I was wondering if you could just let me
That doesn't become unviable. They have money, they will run it. But you know, it's like one more media, it just contributes to the degree of unviable.
Can you clarify how does it become unviable?
No. See, they will spend more.
Yeah.
They will give you better news. They will have more editions, and they will do their circulation. They have the money to do circulation incentives and all of that. And it was a good newspaper. So she was not some rag. You know, I don't know what it's like now, but when it started, it was a good newspaper, and they had the money to do it. But when you're not when you're not, they are not worrying about viability. So when they're not worrying about viability and they're throwing money, this is what this Vanita Khandekar keeps saying, that you keep throwing money because you are non-serious, and it ruins the market for everybody. Because you know, there's just too many of you, because there's some non-serious players in there. And they have their own reasons. They find it useful to have media. Very colorful stories of how politicians own paper.
My question then is media really unviable? So media may not be free, but is it unviable then? Because we are having, like you said, India is slated to be the 5th largest newspaper market. So if we're looking at it primarily in capitalist terms, is the media market unviable? It may be plentiful, it may be unviable.
It will be some of them, no? It will be a few. We may have the readership. No, I said readership, right? Okay, so all of those local papers and all of that contribute to readership. That doesn't mean, you know, because we have so many human beings. So just like you have a huge market, you have a huge readership. And as long as the paper is not dying and they're going on growing, but they compromise on journalism, on ethics, on this and that. So if you're just looking to achieve readership figures, that will be there. They're not saying that it be there.
No, when we're asking or promoting crowdsourced journalism, crowdsourced or subscription-based journalism, are we asking for the news media to work outside of the logic of capitalism? And I'm saying the logic of capitalism is to grow, right? Grow exponentially, and that's how news media has grown, right? So when we're asking for subscription-based journalism, are we asking for it to operate under some other different kind of project, a more ethical project?
No, but capitalism has its limitations, as you can see, as to how many it can support. And also the subscription-based thing, a lot of it is for all these digital players who actually have very little staying power, who don't have a lot of stuff, can't do, they're not going to give you the volume of news. You just read them because they give you more independent sounding news. But if you, and they need the support, and nowadays people need support even to get legal help, because that whole structure hasn't been built up. In 75 years of independence, the media hasn't thought about how do we keep ourselves, how do we defend ourselves. There are lots of lawyers willing to do pro bono, cases. That lawyers will contribute. You can have a fund. You don't have anything. You just play ball. Sorry, but a lot of them.
So I wanted to ask, so the subscription-based media is a little accountable in terms of accountability to the subscriber. but the other media, which is not subscriber based, so there seems to be no accountability. I think that because we see some of the journalists who peddle some fake news on TV and all, they're still journalists and they're still working there. There was no accountability, and I think that is there a mechanism that we can ensure there is accountability?
No, there's no accountability because this country did not bring regulation. You can't have regulation by government or self-regulation by industry. What other countries have, whether it's I think FCC or Ofcom or whatever, you need an outside independent regulator, which for its own reasons no government has brought and passed. I don't know, I mean, I've been covering media now from the late 1980s. How many drafts, this bill, that bill, communication bill, but nothing comes. It's not government. Have an independent regulator. The government has to pass legislation which will say we are setting up, I mean, and if you're setting up independent, it has to be outside the government. Or the industry can set up an independent thing. They can't say self-regulation. They can set up, because self-regulation doesn't work. I mean, they can just get objective human beings and put them there, but why do they want to be regulated? They don't want to be regulated. So that's the problem also, that there's no regulation which works.
What are some examples of these independent regulators again for Western?
I'm trying at Federal Communications Commission. I don't know if they are set up within the government or no, they're not independent. But Ofcom, I think, Ofcom is Britain, and I don't think too many countries actually. All these are ideal things, but I don't know what Australia has, but they do have. Okay. Yeah.
It does have independent regulators in other sectors, right? So it's not impossible.
Yes,
It
yes.
is possible.
But they have to want it, the government, and the people have to, and the thing. Actually, the government has to want it. I don't know why it doesn't.
All right, I'm so sorry, but we're out of time. But we encourage you all to continue the conversation outside. We'll try and refreshments there as well. Thanks so much for being here, and thank you, Sevanti, for this talk. And have a good evening.
Thank you.